Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Paul Price. I'm the CEO and founder of Haven Green. And today I have the great privilege of welcoming Max Lee, Portfolio Manager of the Ecofin Energy Transition Fund, to our series. In his strategy, Max invests in companies focused on a more efficient use of resources and emissions reduction. And given that 2023 was a record year for global temperatures, as we all know, the need for carbon mitigation is only getting stronger. I know today's discussion is going to be timely in that regard. It's very important. Thanks, Max, for your time today. Before we start the questions and the discussion, a reminder that this webinar will run for approximately 30 minutes. Invite you to submit any questions you have either using the chat function on Zoom or via email at info@havengreen.eu. Given the relatively short duration of the webinar, if we do not get to respond to your question live, please be reassured that we will follow up to all questions in the coming days. So let's maybe get started, Max. So Max, over the last 5 years or so, investment in clean energy has reassuringly outpaced spending on fossil fuels. So that's a positive in itself, certainly buoyed by the world waking up to the threat of climate change. However, some of the tailwinds that supported this, falling prices, lower interest rates, favorable policies have turned. So let me ask, maybe controversially at the beginning, is decarbonization still a competitive theme?
Thank you, Paul, and a pleasure to be speaking to you. So on your question, is decarbonization still competitive? Well, I suppose there are a number of different ways of looking at this, but if we look at it from a renewable cost competitiveness perspective, first of all, I think we can say wholeheartedly, yes, very much so. Renewables, wind and solar in particular, are hyper competitive with alternative fossil fuels, or fossil fuel alternatives, that is, in almost all regions. I'd say that one area where fossil fuels have become slightly more competitive again with renewables are with gas-fired power generation in the US, where gas prices have moved lower and therefore brought gas more in line with, say, onshore wind and solar pricing. Having said that, in Europe, renewables are extremely competitive relative on a levelized cost of electricity basis relative to other power generation types. We've, of course, had a very recent example of cost overruns happening in the nuclear space in the UK, with Hinkley Point C just last week saying that they are expecting a further £10 billion cost overrun. So this is a project that was originally expected to cost £26 billion in 2015, and now they're saying it's going to cost more like £36 billion and be another 4 years late. So I think the other element to bear in mind is that a lot of the incumbent technologies are getting more expensive as time goes on, both in terms of building them and in difficulty to permit them as well. Elsewhere, it's worth noting that from an inflationary impulse perspective, you mentioned this in the question, you saw a lot of raw material costs increase in the post-COVID era. That inflationary cycle has pretty much round-tripped. For a lot of the raw materials, steel, polysilicon, it's worth noting that even in the last year alone, lithium, which is an important source of raw material for battery manufacturing, is down at least 78%. So a lot of that inflationary impulse that we saw in the 2021-2022 period has now dissipated significantly. The other area that renewables have become more competitive, but working on that battery theme, is renewables plus storage. Of course, the more renewable energy you can store, the more usable that clean energy is. And given the drops in critical raw materials for batteries, battery pricing is also dropping, which makes renewables plus storage more commercially viable. And of course, the longer that renewables can be stored, the higher the penetration of clean energy can become in overall electricity mix. The area, of course, where we've seen much stickier cost increases in cost of capital, which has certainly put upward pressure on levelized cost of energy for renewables in particular. given that they're very capital intensive and a lot of the spend in renewables happens up front. Having said that, there's clear evidence over the last 2 years that we've been through this rate cycle that a lot of the developers have been able to pass through some of those higher capital costs through higher power pricing and higher power purchase agreement price levels that have been set. So the overall internal rate of returns that the developers have been able to achieve has remained somewhat stable. Some areas that were always expensive, never competitive, and remain in that state include green hydrogen and, for example, also we're reading a lot about it these days, heat pumps that are significantly more expensive, for example, 4 or 5 times more expensive than a conventional boiler. And those are the areas that still need to see some kind of government subsidization to help deliver cost competitiveness or commercial viability. And so you see more boom busts in those areas when, periods when stimulus is introduced or reduced that can seriously affect sales and margins in those areas.
And will we see, you talked about inflation and interest rates. Obviously, when a lot of these projects were planned at the beginning, the interest rate was much lower and we had a pretty benign inflationary environment. So in your view, is there a fallout coming on some projects that may have priced at a higher and with a higher expectation from the, a lower expectation of interest rates and inflation? And how much time will it take to wash that out, or will it have an impact in the market other than transient?
So, of course, there's been some notable examples of this in the last 12 months, albeit they remain somewhat niche. The main area of projects that got caught out by this inflation cycle are the projects that take the longest to build. So that's offshore wind. And we've seen examples in particular with a company called Ørsted, but also others, where projects that were planned 6 years ago have gone through an inflation cycle and cost cycle that wasn't anticipated at the time. And therefore, the price that those projects need to receive in terms of power, purchase agreement pricing or feed-in tariffs needs to be negotiated higher to be able to pass on the higher costs. Offshore wind projects can take 6+ years to build, from planning to final switching on of the plant. And whereas other projects like solar, they can be done in a matter of months, and wind can be done within 1 year, onshore wind, that is, between 1 year to 1.5 years. And so I'd say that those projects from a viability perspective have already flushed through on the onshore piece. It's just that some of these offshore projects that have been caught out are now going through processes of either cancelling or trying to negotiate higher pricing agreements. But those, in the grand scheme of things, remain relatively niche compared to what's happening in the broader scope.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, you touch on it a little bit there when, and I'd like to maybe pivot a little bit to geopolitics and policy influence on renewable power. Maybe dispel a myth that's out there that all of this is done through subsidization. Perhaps as a first thing, is that still the case, or is that something of yesteryear? 2024, of course, is also a big election year. The outcome of the US election in November is going to be particularly important. But we also have, and in the UK, elections coming within the next 12 to 18 months. We have European elections on the way. So all of this could have an influence in terms of, as the balance might shift, the attitude to things like the US Inflation Reduction Act. And so what way as an investor do you think of these geopolitical events impacting green energy stocks, and your thought process around intrinsic value, or how that might actually have to be reset in your approach?
So around the issue of policy has always been an important part of the investment consideration. There's a notable difference, I'd say, between where we are today relative to where we were in 2010, 2011, 2012. And that partly touches on what we've discussed at the beginning of this call, which is that in, a decade ago, 12 years ago, a lot of these technologies weren't commercially competitive with the fossil fuel alternatives. On a head-to-head basis, they were still considerably more expensive. We've gone through cost curve declines on solar, on wind, on batteries, on electric vehicles, on many areas of energy transition that now mean on an unsubsidized basis, they make commercial sense. You see electric vehicle costs crossing over on the sticker price now on an unsubsidized basis in some areas with combustion engine vehicles. Obviously, electric vehicles for the last couple of years on a total cost of ownership basis have already been somewhat cheaper than combustion engine vehicles, but a lot of consumers don't think in those terms. They look at sticker price, and now so we're getting to that point of crossover on vehicle cost. And as we said earlier, solar is very competitive with the almost all fossil fuel alternatives, as is wind. And so we're in a reduced environment of boom bust cycles that are purely contingent upon whether or not government policy comes in some of these big areas or not. Having said that, as you note, 2024 is a major election year. In particular, the US is going to be very important in what's going to happen with the Inflation Reduction Act. Clearly, there are concerns around the potential for Inflation Reduction Act repeal. What will it take to bring that about? Well, it seems like it's highly likely you need the full trifecta. That's the White House, Congress, and Senate, controlled by the Republicans. As things stand, visibility is relatively low as to what the outcome will be. Things are very close. It's a bit of a coin toss as to who's going to end up in the White House. But if you have to do the trifecta, it does reduce your probabilities beyond a coin toss. You have to get all three things. It's probably less than 25% probability today. Having said that, these odds can evolve rapidly as time goes on, as we get closer to November. And then, within the Inflation Reduction Act, which parts of it are more vulnerable than others? There is this tension, which is between sticking to the party line and also the fact that the majority of IRA spend is actually ending up in Republican states. It does create a bit of a conundrum. Having said that, when we look at the IRA as a whole, areas that might be more vulnerable than others include electric vehicle subsidies, which are probably first to be watered down if there was some kind of attempt to repeal the IRA, versus other areas that look safer, like subsidies for carbon capture and storage, subsidies for green hydrogen, subsidies for nuclear PTC, production tax credits. So if you do get this trifecta situation, it's not clear that you're going to get a wholesale repeal of the IRA or even be able to do that. Having said that, there are a number of areas that are more vulnerable than others, as I just outlined. Overall, for us, it means that we're quite careful about adding exposure to big US IRA beneficiaries during this period until we get better visibility on what the outcome might be, given that this issue remains an overhang. Elsewhere, from a policy perspective, in Europe, for example, we're still awaiting real carrots or sticks relating to trade tariffs that might make European domestic producers of renewables more cost competitive. There's been discussion at a country level and at the EU level about domestic support for locally produced renewable equipment, and also tax credits or something similar that echoes what's happening in the US, given that a lot of investment and human capital has now shifted to the US because they've put in place what is a very attractive and fairly straightforward program to encourage more domestic manufacturing in the US of all things related to energy transition. I guess a final comment on that would be zooming out from a policy perspective. It's also worth noting that energy transition itself is somewhat synonymous with energy security. Europe's clearly been through a period now of questioning how it can make itself less vulnerable to exogenous impacts. And so, what you do get through energy efficiency, through the energy transition, and those things like building out your own renewable generation capacity, your own storage capacity, reducing your reliance on gas and oil imports, certainly does drive a lot of the policy goals that we have seen laid out. And therefore, we would expect, more generally speaking, that this progress towards greater self-sufficiency, greater renewables, greater levels of power, battery storage, grid build-out, and energy efficiency to overall reduce the amount of energy produced, will remain firmly on policy agendas. It may just fluctuate in more curtailed periods of time.
Okay, thank you. And obviously, and you made the point earlier on about nuclear and Hinkley Point running over. That is obviously the challenge, I suppose, with these massive scale projects. Also quite interesting, your comment on, and I think most people will not have realized that, I've heard you mention it before, the differential between offshore and onshore wind, assuming onshore is more difficult because of planning permits, but of course the offshore is challenged because of the equipment that's needed to actually build these large arrays out at sea.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so but if we are to strive to achieve the net zero goal, there's a lot of noise suggesting the road is impossible. Can you address some of these concerns? For example, the physical land required if you're trying to put onshore wind on to build all the renewables we need to reach in a net zero situation. Are there enough rare earth metals, which I understand are not entirely rare, but just very hard to find, and precious minerals that might also need to be made available to be the catalyst for this energy transition to happen?
Yeah, that is a question that we've received definitely in the past, and an area of concern. Generally, and I'll get to the materials in a second, generally, what's played out so far in terms of materials has been pricing moving lower faster than anticipated, rather than the opposite. But I'll get onto that in a second, maybe to address the first piece around the actual physical space required, the physical land required. Clearly, different regions will have different approaches based on their own topography. Having said that, there's a study that Tesla did maybe 2 years ago now, where they looked at the viability of essentially shifting all electricity consumption to sustainable energy and storage sources. And in that study, they essentially came out with a conclusion that you would need to deploy a total solar panel fleet of about 18.3 terawatts. Today, we're about 1.5 terawatts, okay? So that's going to require 71 million acres, but that's 0.19% of the total global land area. When it comes to wind turbines, they thought, in their estimation, you'd need roughly 12.2 terawatts of wind. We're around 1 terawatt today, so another 12 times that, what we currently have installed. That's going to require roughly 0.02% of total land area. So on a very crude basis, it's not clear that land availability is going to be an issue. Obviously, it's beneficial to generate power close to where it's consumed. And so there will be some significant transmission build-out demand coming in the next decades. From a regional perspective, some areas, the US, North America, has much more space for onshore wind than Europe does. Europe and populated areas of the US will be more focused on rooftop solar than other parts of the world, where it doesn't necessarily make as much sense. And some regions like Northern Europe are going to be more focused on offshore wind. than others as well. So it's going to depend a lot on resource, but land availability isn't really a constraining factor. However, the overall deployment and the nature of deployment of these different mix of renewables is also going to be contingent on pretty large scale build out of transmission and distribution in the future. In terms of in terms of raw materials, once again, if you look at wind and solar, the majority of the raw materials there tend to be concrete, steel, glass, copper, aluminium, and in the case of solar, polysilicon as well. All of those things are readily available with no real sign of shortage. When you look into batteries, there are some pinch point areas. In particular, I'd say cobalt at the moment. And part of the problem there is not necessarily the overall availability of cobalt, but it's where it's available, and the majority of it coming from the Congo, and concern about supply chains. So what you're also seeing in the world of batteries is battery chemistries shifting to basically phase out some of the harder to access raw materials, and to phase into chemistries that essentially are cobalt free in most cases, and are sourced from more abundant materials. So lithium iron phosphate, for example, is a battery that is cheaper than the traditional nickel manganese cobalt battery, and is gaining more and more market share, especially in China, and now with Chinese exports to the rest of the world. I think you also mentioned, so just to go, in terms of batteries, not necessarily a case that we see any significant pinch points. Lithium has been cited as a concern. Having said that, it looks like lithium's probably going to remain an oversupply for the next 3 years. So it is a case that if prices go up, they tend to drive more exploration for resources, and then that delivers more resources, and therefore the price is contained. And that's how you end up with 78% decline in lithium pricing in the last year alone. When it comes to rare earths, or rare earth metals, as you mentioned, they're used primarily in permanent magnets, which are then put into electric motors for electric vehicles. So very important component. Rare earth metals themselves are fairly abundant. It's just where can you find them in big enough concentrations. The US, for example, used to have a rare earths industry, but then essentially that got phased out as China started to dominate. And there were also environmental risk assessments that made it harder and harder to do rare earths. So I think it's more a policy of not allowing countries like China to own 98% of the rare earth metal industry, and for governments to refocus on their own supply chains, when indeed they can self-supply a lot of these things to a far greater extent than they have in the past.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Max. And then when you're thinking about it as an investor, there's so many, I guess, even if you just think of that, the last 20, 25 minutes of conversation there about the many conflicting themes that you have to think about as an investor. How do you segment them? Maybe give us a little picture of how you think about creating a portfolio that has a balance of all of those from both a risk and a return perspective.
Right. So within the portfolio, we do invest across electrification, clean transportation, industrial and building efficiency, and the circular economy. Generally speaking, we have a pretty good split between companies with primary exposure to clean transportation, electrification, and industrial efficiency. Within circular economy, it's a much smaller part of the investment in universe at the moment, and so it remains much smaller component. From a geographic spread, we tend to be exposed maybe 40% North America, 40% Europe, and the remainder Asia. That's the general split over time. A lot of the companies we invest in will have exposure to more than one of those themes. So if you're, for example, a company that delivers power semiconductors, you might be selling into clean transportation, but you'll also be selling into industrial automation equipment. So you're crossing over a number. There are some big themes. Obviously, electrification is an area we're investing a lot around from the perspective of electricity moving its market share of total energy consumption from 20% to over 60% in the coming decades. So we're looking at investment opportunities in the home and in industrial manufacturing and in the electrification of transport, as well as cost savings. So the areas that save electricity usage and save energy usage as well. I mentioned previously another area that we're focusing on now to an even greater extent is around this transmission piece, given how vital it is in terms of infrastructure to enable the energy transition. So, this might involve pieces of electrical equipment that go into actual building out transmission and distribution grids, cables, could be grid management software, as well as also potentially companies that own the grid assets themselves. So they could be regulated utilities that are seeing acceleration of capital expenditure and therefore driving faster earnings growth. Another big theme for us is around electric vehicles. We're seeing companies or looking to invest in companies that have content uplift with pricing power. So selling into an electric vehicle gives them, for example, 3 times more the content they might get from selling into a combustion engine vehicle, and then being able to hold on to pricing power and profitable operating margins at the same time. This is an area where there's probably been bigger concern more recently. Having said that, despite 2024 likely seeing slower EV sales growth than 2023, it's probably still going to be at least in the mid-teens range, so still growing fairly healthily, and then potentially re-accelerating beyond that. So in these areas, power semiconductors still look quite interesting, small, more niche areas around connectors as well. And then later in the year, we might be able to see how some of the business models that were more affected by the magnitude and velocity of rate increases earlier this year, in the last 18 months, might start outperforming again as rates go sideways or start to drop. Clearly, that was a big headwind for us over the last 18 months. We saw valuation multiples contract significantly. In many areas, companies still seeing positive earnings revisions, but seeing multiple contraction that more than overwhelmed that positive earnings driver. So if we can get a more stable rate environment, and if rates actually then start to decline, there are parts of the energy transition strategy that really benefit from that and start to reverse some of that relative underperformance that we've seen over the last 18 months.
Absolutely. And we have one question has just come in here, Max. I don't know. It said you hadn't raised anything about hydro storage, tidal or wave power, and was wondering is that just too experimental? Well, hydro is obviously not, but the tidal and wave, is it too experimental at this stage? And had you any comments to make on those?
Well, large-scale hydro takes a very long time to build new capacity, and pumped hydro is certainly an area that is still seeing some growth, even in Europe. And that's going to be one of the technologies that helps essentially balance out the intermittency of solar and wind. When it comes to wave and tidal, those are areas that still appear to be very much in cost discovery phase. There's been reliability issues. So they're not technologies that we're seeing being deployed in the mainstream yet.
Okay, so the pensioners are relying on you to deliver those returns in the next 15 or 20 years. You're not going to take any experiments on board at this stage, is what I'm hearing.
Not at this stage, no, Paul.
Okay, That's brilliant. Well, listen, thank you very much, Max. Appreciate it. I hope the audience has enjoyed this. And as I say, any other questions that are coming in, we will get back to you, but we want to try and be strict on time. But appreciate your time today, and from the Haven Green team to all those who took the time to listen into our webinar today. Thank you very much, and have a great day. Take care. Thank you.
Thank you.